community meeting this evening to discuss the ECR bus speed and reliability study. My name is Amy Linehan, and I work for the Government and Community Affairs team for SamTrans. Before we get underway with tonight's presentation, I just wanted to cover a few housekeeping items and meeting logistics. First of all, everyone is currently muted. During the presentation, we do have staff monitoring the chat on Zoom. If you have any questions about the presentation or any comments, please feel free to type your question or your comment in by clicking on the chat button at the bottom of your screen. When you click this button, you will see a pop-up chat window where you can type your question or your comment. Note, you do have the option to ask your question anonymously, but if you do not click that little anonymous box, your name will be displayed to all attendees. We are going to be going to a Q&A session after the presentation, and we'll be going through the questions that are in the chat. We do have time allotted to answer questions that come to us through the chat, and we are going to do our best to get to all the questions in the time that we've allotted for the meeting tonight. In the event we aren't able to answer your question, please feel free to follow up with the project team by emailing us at ecrstudy@samtrans.com. And I am going to ask one of my team members to please put that email address in the chat right now so everybody can see it. We are recording this meeting for note-taking purposes, and we will post the recording of the PowerPoint to the website in the coming weeks. For those of you that are listening in Spanish or Mandarin, we are going to drop links to translated versions of the PowerPoint into the chat right now, so you can view it while we go through the presentation. And again, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Your feedback about this study is very important. Without further ado, I am going to pass the presentation over to Gwen Buckley, Senior Planner for SamTrans, who will walk us through the rest of the presentation. And a note to our speakers, once again, especially for me, please remember to speak slowly so the interpreters that are with us tonight will have time to translate. Thanks, and I will turn it over to Gwen.
Thanks, Amy. Hi, everyone. As Amy said, I'm Gwen Buckley, Senior Planner on the Strategic Planning team at SamTrans. Very excited to have a conversation tonight about the El Camino Real Bus Speed and Reliability Study and the draft recommendations that we're proposing as a part of that study. So the goal of this study is pretty straightforward. We're really looking to increase bus speeds and improve bus reliability on El Camino Real. As you guys are probably familiar with El Camino Real, but it's the backbone of our network, and it actually goes all the way up from Daly City down to San Jose and connects a lot of businesses and stuff. And we're looking to improve bus service so we can create a better experience for our riders, also improve their access to social and economic opportunities. And we also want to improve the experience for our bus operators. It's very stressful to drive on El Camino Real. It can take 2.5 hours one direction, and there's a lot of slowdowns and merging into and out of traffic. So we want to improve that experience for them as well as our riders. Also, there's opportunities to improve the efficiency of the route by speeding it up and attract new riders and bring people back that may have left because of the pandemic. Here is a timeline of the study. We launched early 2021, did a lot of research about route ECR, looking at where the slowdowns are, what's causing the slowdowns, did an inventory of all of our bus stops, and then we identified improvements, and now we're bringing those draft improvements to you guys, to the public. So we're at the tail end of public outreach, and we've also done a lot of outreach to the various stakeholders And then we hope to have the study complete with the final recommendations early fall of this year. The importance of Route ECR is bus really the backbone of our bus network. It serves 13 cities across 28 miles and has 105 bus stops each way. It provides important connections to BART, Caltrain, Muni, VTA, and Palo Alto, and about 2/3 of our other routes. It generates about 25% of our ridership, which is huge. And it also primarily serves lower income riders and people of color. About 80% of ECR riders identify as a person of color, and the average annual income is about $35,000. It's pretty resource intensive, requires a lot of buses and operators. It's about 20% of our operations budget. And as I mentioned, it's a very long, challenging route to operate. Some of you may be familiar with the Reimagined SamTrans study. That study looked at our entire bus network and proposed a final network with that incorporated input from various stages in the study. And it got lots of input from the public. And we heard through that process that the public really wanted faster service and better reliability on Route ECR. And so the final network coming out of Reimagined SamTrans proposes more frequent service on weekends, and also looking at consolidating the stops on Route ECR by up to 30%. And so as part of the process of getting input from Reimagined SamTrans, we heard that about 91% of riders support this final network in some form. Some are somewhat supportive, some are very supportive. And so there is general support from our riders for looking at how to balance the bus stops on Route ECR. And so the ECR study is really building on that work that's come out of Reimagined SamTrans. Just looking at some of the existing conditions. So this is showing the travel speed on Route ECR, the bus travel speed. The far left graph is looking at pre-COVID, so 2019 data, and you can see the bus, there's lots of little slowdowns throughout the corridor in both directions. It's not just one single spot or single city. And then during shelter in place, May 2020, there was some improvement in the bus speed, likely due to lower ridership and also just not as much traffic congestion. And so that demonstrates that there's an opportunity for buses to go faster when they aren't stuck in traffic. And the last graph or map shows the speed of the automobile, and you can compare that to the speed of our buses. And so that's demonstrating that there's the car definitely goes a lot faster than our bus. And we're hoping to make traveling on our bus on Route ECR a bit more competitive with driving. So now kind of moving into the draft recommendations. So we identified recommendations based on a number of different factors. We looked at the expected travel time savings and reliability improvements for the various recommendations. Also thought about the impact that it would have on our riders and some of the trade-offs that come along with that. Of course, looked at the relative cost of some of the recommendations. Some are infrastructure recommendations, so they have a large cost associated with them. And then lastly, looking at the feasibility of what it would take to actually make some of these things happen, because El Camino Real goes through so many different cities, 13 cities, and also is owned by the state. And so a lot of these improvements require coordinating with so many different cities and Caltrans, and it's can be a lot of work. And then there's also constraints with the right of way. So the actual space on the roadway, you can only do so much with what's there. So now looking at the different recommendations. So we focused on 4 different categories or buckets of recommendations. The first one is bus stop balancing. So this is what I mentioned earlier with Reimagined SamTrans. We looked at opportunities to consolidate the bus stops to allow our buses to go a little faster. The second category is capital and bus stop placement improvements. I'll go into a little bit more detail about this, but these are more infrastructure type of improvements. The third one is looking at ways to optimize our transit signal priority system that we already have on El Camino Real. And I'll describe that in a little bit more detail. And the last one is looking at bus only lanes or HOV lanes on El Camino Real. So first category, we did a comprehensive analysis of all 200 or so bus stops on El Camino Real and identified what stops to keep and which stops to remove or consolidate. So we obviously kept the ones that serve important points of interest like hospitals, schools, shopping centers, senior centers, and also serve what we've defined as equity priority communities. Also keeping ones that serve other bus routes and rail stations, and of course keeping ones that are highly utilized, particularly those serving high proportions of seniors and people with disabilities. And we identified stops to remove that were too close to other stops or stops that had accessibility and pedestrian safety issues. So they didn't have crosswalks or sidewalks or things like that. So with that comprehensive analysis, we identified about 64 stops to remove along the El Camino Real corridor, which is about 30% of the overall stops. That is a lot of stops, but we still can maintain consistent spacing throughout the corridor, which is about a quarter mile in high density, high ridership areas and a half mile in low density, lower ridership areas. And as I mentioned earlier, we did see that this bus stop consolidation type of work is supported through the Reimagined SamTrans input that we heard. So 70% of survey respondents said that they would be willing to walk farther for faster bus service. The second category of improvements is capital and stop placement improvements. So I'll go through each one of these. The first one is bus bulb outs. That's where the curb, the sidewalk curb is extended so the bus can stop in the travel lane. And this allows the bus, or the bus no longer has to merge into and out of traffic. It can just stop, pick up passengers and go. And this can also allow more space for our riders to wait at the stop, and we can add more amenities and also reduce the crossing distance as we're extending the curb. The second type of capital improvement is far side stops. So this is moving the stop from the near side of the intersection to the far side, and this allows us to better take advantage of the transit signal priority system that we have, which I'll talk about in a minute. And it also prevents delays, other delays associated with the intersection. Queue jumps are pretty interesting. This is where the bus typically has a dedicated signal. So as it's waiting at the intersection, it gets the green light before the other cars in the other lanes, and it can kind of jump the queue of cars that are waiting. So that can help save time and reduce intersection delays. Lastly, we looked at pedestrian improvements. So there's a lot of areas on El Camino Real where there aren't sidewalks or there aren't adequate crosswalks. And so we're really thinking about our entire experience of our riders and how we can improve access to our bus stops. So we identified some opportunities for improvements there as well. So for capital improvements, our recommendations include bus bulbs at about 70 different stops along the corridor, queue jumps at 7 different stops, pedestrian access improvements at about 40 stops, and then relocation of about 15 to 25% of stops, mostly from near side of the intersection to far side. The third category of recommendations is looking at the existing transit signal priority system that we have. It's installed at every intersection on El Camino Real. And how it works is where when a bus is approaching the intersection, it requests a green light extension. And so the light will extend by about 8 seconds, up to 8 additional seconds, because it knows the bus is coming. And we see that there's a lot of ways to optimize this and really understand how it's working, and ways to either improve the green light extension time, or also by relocating our stops from near side to far side, we can take advantage of that. So the bus isn't sitting at a stop while it's also requesting a green light. Lastly, we explored the opportunity for bus only lanes on El Camino Real. This measure by far has the most improvement potential for improving the speed of our buses. As you can imagine, if it's not stuck in traffic, it will definitely go faster. And so we looked at different areas along El Camino Real that were candidates for bus only lanes. And we really focused on 4 different factors. So first, looking at areas where there were pinch points and slowdowns in 2019. So before COVID, when traffic was at the worst we've seen in the past few years. Also looked at places where there was an increase in speeds during COVID. So that shows that there's an opportunity for a bus to go faster when it's not stuck in traffic. Focused on areas where there's also higher passenger loads. So we really want to make sure we're benefiting the greatest number of riders and focusing on areas where there's high ridership. And lastly, of course, we looked at the existing right-of-way. So we focused on areas where it's 3 lanes in each direction, because there are areas in El Camino where it's 2 lanes in each direction, and that's not quite as feasible for a bus-only lane. And so with those 4 factors, we identified areas in the city of San Mateo, Millbrae, San Bruno, and Menlo Park. We have had initial conversations with the cities, but also recognize that there's so much going on in El Camino. There's a lot of proposals and plans for bike lanes on El Camino, and so that cuts into the right of way. And there are great ways to have bus lanes and bike facilities, but it just takes up a lot of space. So we will definitely continue those conversations with these cities. Oops. So looking ahead, we are still in outreach, but we will also be continuing our coordination and our conversations with the cities and Caltrans around these recommendations. It is so important to get their buy-in and their support for what we're proposing, because they control a lot of they have jurisdiction over the areas where we want to make improvements. And then we also are going to take all the findings and everything we've heard from the cities, from the public, from our operators, and incorporate that into our final recommendations that we plan to bring to the board in early fall of this year. So really just taking everything we've heard and coming up with the final recommendations. And right now we're looking at implementing the bus stop balancing piece in early 2023. There are so many factors that are that play into when exactly that will happen. But we will go back out to the public and provide additional communication before we implement that. So this isn't the last time you can provide any comments on what bus stops you want to see removed, or which ones you want to keep. We have a project website. You can provide comments obviously during this meeting, but you can also go to our website to explore more information about the draft recommendations. And you can download the full list here. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a button that says click here to download the full list. And sorry, this is at samtrans.com/ECR study. You can also submit a comment. And then we also have an interactive map. Okay, let me show that. So this map shows the bus stops that we're proposing to remove. This is a draft, very early draft. And as I said, we are really looking at what we're hearing from the cities and from you guys, and we'll incorporate that before we finalize anything. So we want to hear everything now. And so you can go and click on the different stops and provide comments and agree or disagree with what we're proposing. And so that pretty much concludes my presentation about the draft recommendations. I do want to invite everyone to ask questions in the chat. Here are some prompting questions. So in addition to maybe questions you have about the study, we also just want to hear if you have any thoughts about or want to share your experience about riding Route ECR and what that is like for you, if you experience a lot of slowdowns, if it's unreliable, or maybe you have other ideas for ways we can improve Route ECR and make it go faster. So definitely want to hear from you. And I think I'll hand it over to Amy to facilitate the Q&A.
Great. Thanks, Gwen. Great presentation. So yes, as Gwen said, we are going to begin our Q&A portion of the evening. During this part of the meeting, you can ask questions or provide feedback or any comments you may have about the presentation using that chat function at the bottom of your screen. Please note we are doing this in real time. So everybody be patient with me a little bit as I attempt to toggle between about 3 different laptop screens. And don't be shy. We intend this to be as interactive as it possibly can be. I will just kick things off with a couple of questions that we got. First of all, when are the first set of changes we can expect? And when would that happen?
Yeah, so what we're looking at right now for implementation of some of these recommendations, well, first we have to finalize them and really incorporate all the feedback that we've heard. But we tentatively have plans to implement the bus stop balancing piece in early 2023. And we will go back out and do signage at the bus stop and get another round of input on the stops we're proposing to remove before we actually go out and take away stops. But that's the timeline for the bus stop balancing piece. And then I think there is definitely more ambiguity around the capital improvements and the bus only lanes, as you can imagine. We are going to work very closely with the cities to try and incorporate a lot of these improvements like bus bulbs and things like that into their existing plans and existing capital improvement processes. So they can easily move that forward. And then SamTrans, we might also take initiative and help lead some of the capital improvements, but it's definitely more longer term than the bus stop balancing.
And what kind of outreach have we done so far to get the message out about this study and the recommendations in the study?
Yeah, so we well, first we've looked at a lot of the input that was received during the Reimagined SamTrans process. So a lot of that was specific to Route ECR. So we took that, before we even went out to the public, we took that information and incorporated that into the recommendations and the way we're approaching this project. And since mid-April, we have had our website up with opportunities to comment. We've had ambassadors going out to the bus stops and riding the routes and talking to riders and getting input that way. We have also talked to a lot of our bus operators about where they are seeing slowdowns and what ideas they have as well. They have very detailed ideas. And we've have this community meeting. Let's see what else. We've done quite a bit of outreach. And I think we've received over 100 comments so far, not including the comments on the map. So looking forward to looking through those and incorporating those into the final recommendations. And can I just respond to a comment in the chat?
Of course.
Yeah, so I see Javi said that the portion of ECR in South San Francisco has 6 lanes and should be included. And I do think there's a lot of space in South San Francisco. And when we were talking to staff in South City, just staff level, they seemed very receptive initially to the idea of a bus only lane. I think it didn't show up in our initial analysis because we don't have, or because our bus already goes fairly fast through South City, but we're not going to necessarily constrain where we are looking just based on the initial analysis. Like if a city comes to us and is like, let's do a bus lane, we will hopefully, we'll figure out the feasibility, but hopefully be able to work with them on that. So there is space in other cities, and we are open to any opportunity for a bus lane because they're very effective, but they can be challenging to implement.
And speaking of specific cities, did all of the cities along the ECR look and approve of the changes that we're recommending as part of this study?
We've talked to every city at the staff level. They had specific comments and feedback that we'll include into the final recommendations. And in general, they were very supportive of these proposed improvements, which is really great to hear from the cities. And same with our conversations with Caltrans. I think there's just a lot of questions about how to implement it and how to get the funding to implement some of these proposals. But we will be continuing to talk to the cities as we're finalizing some of the recommendations. And then after the study, it'll be even more talking to the cities to implement and incorporate it into existing processes.
Great.
I also, if anyone has just any other comments too, like we don't have to just have questions, but if anyone has any comments they'd like to share in the chat, feel free to do that. Yeah, but are there any other questions, Amy?
We have a couple of questions, yeah.
Okay.
It may be helpful if you stop sharing your screen so everybody can kind of see us a little bit better. That makes it a little bit easier to talk sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Great, and we can always go back to the presentation if anybody wants to see another slide. I wanted to take things a little bit 30,000 foot level, ask you sort of a philosophical question that came into the chat.
Okay.
Why is this study important right now? Why are we thinking about bus speed on ECR right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think we've always known how important Route ECR is and how important that corridor is for our bus network. But we are approaching this study. So historically, we have done a BRT study on looking at opportunities for bus rapid transit on El Camino Real. And something that's challenging is to get all of the cities on one page, because they're all in various stages of planning for improvements on El Camino Real, and as well as Caltrans. And so this study is looking at smaller scale, but still very, very impactful improvements to speed up our buses. So while it's not bus rapid transit, it still can have these improvements, can still have a very significant impact on the way our bus operates on Route ECR, and allowing our riders to access more jobs, more like school, just having better access and more reliable access to different opportunities. And especially before the pandemic, we just saw congestion getting worse and worse and worse. And with that, it requires us to provide more buses and more operators to run the same level of service. So by speeding up our bus, we can we don't have to use as much resources, and we can reinvest that back into the route. So maybe even increasing the frequency and making it even better route. So there's just a lot of opportunities that can come out of making the bus go faster. So it is looking at smaller scale, but still impactful recommendations. Yeah, hope that answers the question.
And you talked a little bit about bus balancing in the presentation. If someone wants to know if their specific stop, a stop they use on a regular basis, is being proposed to be removed, what's the tool they can use to get that information right now?
Yeah, they can go to www.samtrans.com/ECR study, and then scroll down into the "We want to hear from you" little drop down, and then there's the interactive map that's there that I was talking about earlier, and people can go and provide comments on the specific stops and see how the bus stop balancing could potentially affect them.
Great. And I got a question about bike lanes on El Camino. Can we make these changes and add bike lanes on El Camino Real?
Yeah, I mean, that's a hard question to answer. There are great ways to design some of these improvements with a bike lane and with a protected bike lane too. So for example, for the bus bulb out, which I was talking about, there's opportunities where the bus bulb out could actually be an island, and then the riders have to cross over the bike lane to get to the island, and then the bus can still stop in lane. And the riders just have to make sure they look for the bikes that might be coming when they cross. But it's a great configuration when there's the space for it. And there's also, this is probably not ideal for El Camino, but there's a lot of, or there's some examples out there where the bus can share the lane with the bikes, but that can create conflicts. But yeah, it really, El Camino is very dynamic and different as you go city to city, and cities do have different plans for bike lanes on El Camino. So some are proposing protected bike lanes, others proposing a not protected bike lane, others proposing parallel bikeways. So we are definitely open to the safe ways to have both bike facilities and bus facilities. And maybe we don't need to prioritize parking cars on El Camino Real, you know, maybe that's not the highest on our prioritization list. So there's opportunity there, but it can be challenging to coordinate and to have space for those different modes.
We did get a question that I wanted to pose to the team regarding our feedback loop and how we're taking comments into consideration. Somebody wants to know if on the interactive map, if a person clicks on the disagree button, how much of that feedback will we be taking into account when we decide what the eliminated stops ultimately will be?
Yeah, so we will definitely, like, what we're hearing from the public is a huge part of what will impact the final list of bus stops as part of the bus stop balancing. And it's hard to, there are other factors that will play into it, such as what we've heard from the cities, what we've heard from, or just the general spacing, the actual ridership of the routes. But I do want to reassure you that what we're hearing from the public is a huge part of our consideration for the final list. And I also will say that we kind of went in a little aggressive, I don't know if that's the right word, but we went in knowing that we would be reintroducing some stops. So proposing right now to remove 30%, but maybe it will fall more around like 25% or 20%. So that's our approach to this. And if you have any very specific concerns, also please reach out to me or to the project email address, and feel free to share those, or continue to interact with the map as well. But we're definitely considering public comments.
Yeah, those public comments and feedback are always really important to the SamTrans team for any of these kinds of bus studies that we do. And we really do take feedback seriously. We actually look at it and really do take it into account when we come up with our final plan. So yes, if you have any ideas, let us know. Don't hesitate at all. I got a specific question about construction that I wanted to ask you, and I know we're probably pretty far away from actually implementing any capital projects as a part of this project, but when it comes to the construction of the improvements, do you think that will result in any impacts to pedestrian traffic? Will it result in any detours? Any thoughts on that right now, or are we just a little too far out?
Yeah, well, we're pretty far out from that, but I think part of the process is making sure that there aren't significant impacts and just being very thoughtful about the impacts that will happen during the construction phase of implementation. In the topic of construction, though, I did want to mention that something we've heard just through some of the public comments is how construction projects are a huge slowdown for our buses. They just put the cones out and then our buses are stuck in just the one lane with all the other cars. And it can be unpredictable, or just feels sudden that all of a sudden there's construction one day and not the next. And so because that's temporary in nature, it's not necessarily we explored in a lot of detail as part of this study, but there could be opportunities for improving or being more thoughtful about traffic patterns and how that impacts the bus as part of all of the construction that's happening on El Camino Real. And how that impacts access to our bus stops too, because there's times where we have to move a bus stop when there's construction and it may not always be super clear where it's moved to. So that's something that I think we can look at down the road a little bit.
Let's just talk about the implementation one more time, just so everybody knows what our plan for implementation is, that we're not trying to make all of these changes at once.
Yeah, we're not. It's, well, we're not gonna be implementing everything at the same time. We are looking at implementing the bus stop balancing piece initially, and then looking at opportunities for where we can incorporate some of the capital improvements into maybe some existing projects that either Caltrans or the cities are doing. But there may be some additional opportunities where we do like a segment of El Camino that maybe goes through multiple cities, and we're like, let's add bus bulbs to this segment, and that we could coordinate on that, and that is more all at once, but still not all of the changes at the very same time, you know. So clearly we're still thinking a lot about how to implement this and what that looks like. And I think we will still be learning how that actually happens after the study. But it's still exciting that cities and Caltrans are very receptive to these improvements.
And I actually think that is a great note, great point to end our meeting on for this evening. I appreciate all of you participating. We really do appreciate your feedback. Just a few final things before we close out tonight. This presentation, along with additional information about the project, will be posted on the project webpage. And again, that webpage is www.samtrans.com/ECR study. Please feel free to email us if you have any additional questions or comments. That email address was put in the chat. And with that, I would like to thank you all again so much for participating. And that's going to conclude our meeting tonight. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.